Hola, hello, this is Goyo from the No Te Rindas Intermediate English Stories podcast. As we approach Halloween, I thought we'd look back to last year's Halloween story that centers on ghosts, myths, and legends in my area near Atlanta, Georgia, USA. I hope you enjoy this rebroadcast. Y quiero recordarles que tengo un nuevo programa en YouTube que se llama Where Does Gary Go? ¿A dónde va Gary? Where Does Gary Go? Y es mi nuevo programa para niños que quieren aprender inglés. Chécalo, por favor. Thanks for checking out Where Does Gary Go on YouTube. Here comes the episode.
Welcome to the No Te Rindas Intermediate English podcast, home of the Tenaz Intermediate English app, disponible en noterrindaspodcast.us. Este es un podcast para hispanohablantes que quieren mejorar su comprensión auditiva del inglés de los Estados Unidos. Somos dos hermanos americanos con raíces mexicanas. Soy Gabo o Gabe, aquí con mi hermano mayor Goyo o Greg.
Americans love the spooky traditions of Halloween and the thought of a good susto, or scare. Tonight we will tell you a little tale set in the 1860s, los 1860s, during a violent era of U.S. history. I'm talking about our Guerra Civil, or Civil War, and the years 1861 to 1865, 1861 hasta 1865.
Oh, I want to hear about this.
So, oyentes, in the years before the war, the U.S. had three large regions, primarily. The North, the South, and the West. The North was economically industrial, the South agricultural, and the West relatively new to American eyes. Now, the powerful in the South were landowners of enormous farms called plantations, and they wanted to maintain slavery, as the enslaved planted and harvested their crops, prepared food, and helped tend to the children. Los esclavos sembraban y cosechaban, preparaban la comida, y vigilaban a los chicos. In 1861, states in the South began leaving the Union of the United States because Americans outside the South would not permit slavery to the new Western territories to the satisfaction of the powerful in the South. Now, it's way more complicated than that, but that's enough. Now, Gabe and I live in the South, and the South believed in maintaining that slavery. Thankfully, the South lost the war and the country was reunited. But not before around 600,000 people died. 600,000 personas, Gabe.
Man.
Yeah. So I, Goyo, live in the area of the South where the Union, or Federal Army, marched through in 1864, as it began to win the war. Therefore, there was a great deal of death and suffering in my area. And so there are many stories of ghosts. And hauntings, or fantasmas. If you wish to look up the history of my town, it's called Marietta, Georgia. It has a kind of Plaza Mayor called the Marietta Square, where many dead bodies from the South and the North were stored until their burials.
Man.
Yeah, chécalo in Google and YouTube. Let's begin in 1858. At that time, a child named Mary Root met a young Judah Mosby at a Baptist church just west of Marietta. He was 2 years older than she. By the time he left for the war in 1862, they were engaged to be married, o comprometidos. So they wrote letters back and forth as he followed the war. Mary pressed dried flowers into her letters, and he drew small pictures at the bottom of his of the children that they wanted to have, along with their future names, Nathaniel, Seamus, and Abigail. So, Gabe, obviously they didn't have any children, but they wanted to name them Nathaniel, Seamus, and Abigail.
Okay.
In 1863, Judah's unit was close enough to Marietta that Judah came home for a few days on leave, o vacaciones, which we talked about in our episode last week. Judah and Mary went before a preacher, o pastor, and they were married. The preacher had performed a funeral in another town called Lost Mountain, Georgia, in the morning that day. And so he had to travel between Lost Mountain and Marietta and could not marry them until sundown, al atardecer, as rain began to fall. It didn't matter, though. Finally, they were going to be united in marriage. Judah could tolerate the thought of returning to war, knowing that she was his bride. So, oyentes, everything started well, with a brief ceremony at the Baptist church, and his mother on piano. Their misery began as they exited the church and crossed the street in downtown Marietta. There was little light that night, as the city did not light its lamps. Lamp oil was, precious due to the war. And of course, it was raining. Judah, focusing on keeping the rain off of his new wife, stepped heavily on the foot of the widow Agatha Davenport, the elderly aunt of the famous physician, Dr. Carrie Cox. Now, though Carrie Cox is known today as the very first physician in Georgia, he practiced what we might call alternative medicine.
Oh.
His teas and his potions seemed more magic than medical to some, and many quietly suggested that he was no doctor, but instead a mystical wizard, un mago o hechicero.
Whoa.
So Dr. Cox was not the only one in the family with these mysterious talents. Old Agatha Davenport apparently had the same healing abilities of her nephew, Carrie Cox. But there was one difference. She lacked his kind personality. She had suffered an accident on a horse in her 20s, and it left her walking with a limp, la dejó con una cojera, and unable to have children of her own. She became bitter or amarga and mean-spirited as she watched her friends grow their own families. Furthermore, she had become even more cruel and impatient after her husband's recent death. So by 1863, the children of Marietta called her a mean old witch, una vieja bruja.
Dang, that sounds scary.
Uh-huh. Watch where you're going, you clumsy ox, she hissed. Judah apologized and began to explain. I beg your pardon, madam. I did not see you there. Yes, we were just married, and Judah returns to the war tomorrow, said his wife, defending him. We have so much on our minds. Silence, she shrieked. So happy are you, the young couple. I was once like you. So happy are you together, but unhappy shall you be, and apart. Then she muttered some words in another language and crossed the muddy street.
I would have been out of there.
Well, as they made their return on the road west, Mary, who should have been full of joy, was instead full of fear and dread. We are cursed, she said. O nos ha hecho un embrujo. Sooner or later, that woman's spell will work its evil on us. There, Judah consoled. Tranquila, tranquila. We are married now, and the war will end soon. We shall be happy forever, and forget about that old woman. By the next morning, Mary's fears were realized. As the sun rose, al amanecer, so did her fever, su fiebre, and she could not get out of bed. Judah, for his part, was in agony with worry over his new bride. Yet he couldn't stay with her because his leave was over and he had to return to the Confederate Army.
Okay.
Or the Southern Army north of there. At midday, in tears, they said goodbye. Judah going north by train to his army unit, and Mary heading east to a temporary hospital in the center of Marietta. Many wounded Southern soldiers, also called rebels, occupied the eyes and the hands of the few doctors and nurses who were available. And Mary lay alone and neglected for many hours without being seen. To pass the time, she read and reread a few of the letters that Judah, her now husband, had written to her, tracing her finger over the drawings of little boys and girls sketched in the margins and at the corners of the pages, las esquinas de las páginas. Gabe, she did not live through the night.
Oh.
At dawn, her body was found in the corner of a dirty room, normally used for keeping wood dry for the fireplace. She was holding his letters against her chest. Now Judah, for his part, did arrive back to his unit near Chattanooga, Tennessee. 5 days after his arrival, Union troops, also called Federal troops, attacked his company with rifle, cannon fire, and Judah, rowing a boat with 5 other soldiers, o remando un bote con 5 otros, died on the Tennessee River. Mayroot, where are you? He was heard to call by the survivors, as Mayroot was his nickname, or apodo, for Mary Root, his love. This is not the end of the story, Gabo. The war ended, and businesses came and went through the region as history marched on in time. The temporary hospital where Mary perished, it's now called the Marietta Museum of Art, and is said to be haunted, o embrujado. At night, the staff sometimes hear a woman's voice and see a ghostly figure in the shadows of rooms, crying out, Nathaniel, Seamus, and Abigail. Nathaniel, Seamus, and Abigail. The names of the children that she never had. And appropriately for an art museum, simple illustrations of 3 children are drawn in the fog of the glass on the windows, or left on pieces of paper brown with age, found next to cups from Starbucks or napkins from McDonald's from a rushed staff breakfast. Does a weeping ghost leave drawings for them as she cries for her children? Up north of Marietta in Chattanooga, Tennessee, oyentes, Judah's presence makes its mark too. On the southern bank of the Tennessee River, La Orilla, close to the Chattanooga Aquarium, visitors report seeing a large rowboat in the water on moonlit nights. From the boat, an apparition, un espectro, with the form of a young man, pulls the oars and cries out, Mayroot, Mayroot, where are you, my love? Thank you for listening to our story. Although based in local traditions and history that you can read about on the internet, this story is fiction. We hope that you feel more comfortable with words like haunting, witch, wizard, ghost, and apparition. Happy Halloween!